pleased to be able to inaugurate the series on the optimistic note joined by Florian Idenburg of Soil. Before beginning, I want to announce that we will have a reception afterwards. We'll also announce, please don't leave before it's over. We won't open it until we're done. For drinks and snacks and more discussion. There's been a little bit, there'll be a little bit of a lag in the lecture series. We'll start again 4 Mondays from now. We'll start again in 4 in a row, starting October 20th. For the next 4 Mondays from then on, we start with the return of our prodigal son, Alex Lammer, and then Farshid Musavi, Dietrich Norman, and Louis Blanks. I should also, for those of you who don't follow tweets or whatever it is people get these days, I should say that just today UIC was announced as one of 4 finalists for the Obama Presidential Library. So we're now going to see with an MS in architecture from Delft University of Technology, Florian Idenburg founded Brooklyn-based Soil, Solid Objectives in Berlin, with Big Blue in 2008, after Florian worked for 8 years at Sonnet in Tokyo. At this point, our distinguished dean from the South Side will take over, since it's actually when Bill Arix was the dean at the Verlag that Florian took a workshop at the Verlag and met Sejima for the first time, and the rest is history. Soil has worked on a range of scales of projects, from prints for the Guggenheim Museum to a master plan for a cultural campus in Seoul. The work has been exhibited at the Guggenheim, MoMA, LA Forum, the Menaki Museum in Athens, and just now at the Art Institute of Chicago with a show that opened this weekend called Veil of Architecture. The work has been published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Surface, Wallpaper, Domus, Architectural Record, on and on. In 2010, they won the MoMA PS1 competition, the Young Architects program, where they installed the project at PS1. They also won the ALA Young Practices Award, and in 2013, the Emerging Voices Prize from the Architectural League of New York. In my sort of fantasy football of architectural offices and tendencies, sort of like Charles Jenks-like combinations, I always thought there would be an ideal sweet spot, which would somehow be this fictional place where you can combine contemporary Japanese and contemporary Dutch architecture somewhere. That should happen. It turns out it's a great place to be, and Soil is maybe the only firm that occupies that conceptual parade. So I'm glad that virtual team now has a leader and a roster. Florian has taught at the GSD as well as Columbia, Princeton, and the University of Kentucky. From personal testimony, I can say that by far his student work at Harvard really stood out. Was most compelling by far, or let's say at least it would have a likely home here and not so much there. So I would like him to consider that he's a made man in Chicago, and I hope that he comes back frequently to visit us in the future. Florian.
Faces from a long time ago, some new faces here as well. It's my first lecture in Chicago.
See?
Yeah. It's funny, we were just talking. I mean, indeed, I met Bill a long time ago, and we were talking about sort of the trajectories that you can choose, the paths you can follow, and how you end up in certain places. I'm Dutch. I went to Japan. Jane, my partner, she's Chinese. She also went to Japan. She studied at Tulane. He ended up by chance in New York. And from the introduction, you can still hear that we're still considered young practices or a young office. And I had to think about it a little bit coming out here because we're in a way of transition. And I was wondering if I should talk about recent work or something, but I actually decided that it was more interesting to stick to sort of the story that has to that really deals with sort of how to start and and since, sort of dragging this idea of youth as long as we can. So I will start with exactly, or just a little bit over 6 years ago when we started in New York in 2008, and a month later we got bankrupt. Not because we started our firm, but vice versa. This was very important for us to think. So coming from the Netherlands and coming from China, those are societies where in a way this idea that we can create society through shaping its physical realm, and the architect playing a role within that is it sort of sits within our DNA. And so when we started our firm, we were very committed in soil objectives, has to do with this idea of solidifying ideas. So a commitment to making architecture within society, a commitment to realizing physical structures, really trying to engage with society, operating in it as architects, not just as sort of partakers in the building industry, but actually creating architectural ideas, not outside in the world. So this happened. Half of the architects lost their job in New York at that time. 1/3 of the offices closed. And so then the question is, what can architecture do within such conditions, and why? How is, say, the practice of architecture so incredibly tied into the shockwaves of the economy? So there's very little to do. There was a lot of time to contemplate and trying to think of a project that was not so directly tied or had such a strong one-to-one relationship with the economy itself. Can there be an architecture that is somewhat independent, but still engages with the real world out there? And there were some other instabilities certainly affecting our thinking as well. This is obviously the earthquake in Japan. We also had Sandy, obviously, in New York. And this idea that architecture somehow, through, say, sustainability, can prevent us from these things, or that in some way we can, through design, offer some sort of response to this, also seemed to us very questionable. The idea that we, through design, can solve problems that are so large that, we realized again that maybe we should not try to engage in design in a very direct manner, dealing with these issues, but again more reflective and trying to find a practice that actually contemplates these instabilities, these unpredictabilities, and this uncertainty. And the third uncertainty that is sort of affecting our thinking is the sort of very rapid virtualization of our space. So where maybe in the past architects were an example of an idea that how we can structure physical space and what sort of effect it has on social relationships, on connections, on interactions. But a lot of that has been sort of turning into bits. And so what is the role of architecture if it's not so much engaged anymore in sort of the shaping of these relationships? So out of these thoughts, because we had time, because there was not so much else to do, this idea of determination grew, and so this has been, in a way, our sort of operative motive. To be determined speaks to a determination to engage with our world and have architecture be the thing that we try to position within that. And at the same time, obviously, it is also about leaving certain things open. So if architecture, when you hire an architect, actually, or when somebody engages an architect, there's in a way this promise that things will be better afterwards, right? That's what design does. But if you can leave things open, if you can, so what we found suspicious is this idea that you think of something and you have to hold on to that all the way till the end in its realization. Somewhere, things, the intent, tends to get lost. And we were interested in trying to find a project that was not so much trying to hold on to sort of very predetermined notions, but actually finds within the process also a space for discovery. Say, a new beauty maybe within this uncertainty of the day that we operated. I think things are going a little bit better. Still, this was very much what affected our thinking. So I will show some projects from the beginning and some projects we're working on now, and you'll see a gradual, I think, transition and the development of these thoughts and finding different ways or outlets of these ideas. As Bob mentioned, we, in 2009, invited to think about the courtyard at PS1. And this is one of the few places, I think, for young practices in this country to do a speculative, meaning a sort of research project within a real space, that engages an audience larger than just, say, the architectural community, which is the Young Architects program. So you probably are familiar with this project. It's a courtyard in front of PS1. Currently part of the MoMA since a couple of years. Ask every year 5 young firms to come up with an idea to fill in the courtyard that needs to have a feeling of an urban beach in a way for, say, an audience and a generation that can't leave the city but does want to have some sort of escape. So the brief is very simple, which is provide space for a bar and provide space for events. There's warm-ups here to DJs and provide some shading. And so that's a quite straightforward program. But at the same time, it obviously also asks you to respond to the condition of architecture today, or to respond to the notion of MoMA, right? Because it's for us, what's going to drive us. So it asks something larger than just adhere to this program. And this year, for the first time, that year that we joined, we had to also deal with the issue of sustainability. MoMA was a little bit late at the party, but they decided that sustainability should also be part of the thing you address. And so, how do you make a sustainable party space that is only up there for a couple of months? Obviously, it didn't make sense to, take a green farm out there. We wanted to have something that actually would work more as a space that people would start to contemplate and think about in a more, I would say, in a more abstract manner. We were interested in the idea of MoMA, and MoMA as the treasurer of modernity, the idea that we can design our problems out of the world, this idea that we offer a structure in which people can operate. And we were interested in this idea of fragileness, elasticity, flexibility, some weakness within that structure. And we started to just set out a very straight, white Cartesian grid, but we were interested in this idea of a weak structure, a structure that doesn't offer actually stability, but is actually unstable, and where you, as visitor, as a user, are responsible for its stability. We are actually responsible for keeping this system in place, and we can affect it. And if we set it in motion, it will have ripple effects throughout. So the idea to fill the entire courtyard with a grid of weak posts, elastic connections, pivoting bases. The system is very simple. It's a surf mast base actually that goes into the ground. Glass fiber poles, 30 feet tall, flexible as well, connected through elastic cords. Through some ingenious knotting hook, we were able to figure out how to calibrate this system that would be in perpetual motion. And then we designed a number of activators, so things where people would engage with the system. Hammocks, rings, pulleys, and balls to sort of calibrate the system, and I'll come back to you later on that. And so you have to present this to the board of MoMA, and we say, well, so what are you presenting for a party space where everybody's drinking beer? We're proposing to cover the entire courtyard with a structure that's always on the verge of collapse, and that people can activate. So we thought it was going to be tricky. So just before we presented, we made this image in Photoshop, and we grabbed the logo of Bureau Happens from their website. And he said we had calculated the entire thing, and it would stand. And so we won. And we actually had to call Bureau Happel. They said that they would help, but they had no idea what we were doing. And he said, this is what we're doing. And he said, well, that's very interesting, because it is impossible to calculate. Because what you do is the opposite of what we do. Because we design risk out of the system. And what you're trying to do is actually come up with a system that can incorporate as much uncertainty as possible. So the only thing we can do is just build it. So the next day, we went to the courtyard, and we got some poles, we got some nets, and we just started to play around with the system. So this was literally the second or third day, so we just worked with some material to find. And it was very promising, and this is supposed to move, but things don't always go well. A day later, we got this message from the operations guy saying, "Hey, please come clean up the trash here in the yard because we have a sponsored event." So we had to clean everything up quickly, but you know, over time and through trial and error, we were able to sort of calibrate the system and find sort of this gently oscillating system of literally nets, poles, and bungee cords. And so we then added some features as a pole, some misters to keep people cool. And also we needed these balls in a way to calibrate the system. This is also to suggest the idea of play and basically get people engaged and start activating the system. And so it was designed not as a game, but by choosing 3 colors and having this grid, it sort of started to generate ideas. Like people themselves started to engage with it in different ways and come up with their own games. So people would, for instance, try to get all the green balls to one side or something. But it became really a very active space, and it was interesting to see. These are images we found online, how something that is not so determined in its intention actually triggers completely different ways of usage and usage that we even hadn't imagined. Here we go, this was said by the lawyer of Wilmot to us. We were fully responsible for anybody, any sort of bodily harm that this station would do. So this is the big courtyard, then there's a small courtyard. This is basically filled with sand. And again, because the system is a very open system, and sort of, I think, triggered different ideas amongst different people. We were approached by Eric, the acoustical engineers of Eric, and they said, isn't it nice to do something with sound as well within this? Because this is so much about the tactile and about people sort of engaging with the physical structures. Is there an additional layer that we can contribute? And we said, sure, let's try something. And what we then did is we put in those 8 poles that you see marked there, we put accelerometers, which are things that basically measure where something is in space in the X, Y, and Z. Also, you have it in your phone. And we connected those to 8 speakers. And we identified 8 tones that had some sort of relationship with each other. By moving this pole in an X, Y, and Z, you would affect the tone and the volume coming out of this thing. Basically, to make the thing create a sound. So here you see these speakers along the courtyard. You see people engaging with that instrument that now became sort of a collective instrument. And once we had that data set, so basically we then thought maybe this was a collaboration we did with 2x4, graphic design and media. So they said, can we not find another sort of hybrid space between the physical and the virtual? This is an app we designed at the time. It was still possible to make apps very quickly, where the 8 poles were connected through the phone. You could change the effect level of the sound coming out of the pole. So many people were like shaking this pole, and at the same time they were on their phone trying to have the sound change the reverb or echo or what have you. And with that data set, because you could measure basically where all these things were relative to each other in space, we could do something else as well, which is you could actually have a live feed of this thing in motion on your phone. And so, although the installation was very specific, in the courtyard, very much about sort of engaging with the space there, at the same time there was sort of this virtual version living as a direct feed online, so I could call my mother, and she could see me shaking pole. So, now this video is supposed to play. Something very quickly and temporary and cheap, which is what we want to an extent this year. Responsible yourself for the budget, you have to build it yourself. You get a lot of people who think you can do things very cheap and very fast, that have a certain elegance. It's a quite, not much after this, we were approached by Frieze, the Frieze Art Fair. And this project also has something to do with this idea of taking something static and making it more flexible and pliable. This is Randall's Island in New York. On the left you see Manhattan, in the back you see Bronx, and here you see Queens. Randall's Island is actually a very large island in a way nobody knows because nobody lives there. There are sports fields. There is a training ground for firefighters. There's a mental hospital. And there is a water treatment facility. There was also this patch over here, which is a large piece of land along the river. Here. And it's quite beautiful, and it's the only size or site in New York, apart from Central Park, that could hold a very large tent. Because Frieze in London, which is an art fair that existed already for a while, decided to come to New York, and they asked us to help them for 2 years design their presence in New York. And they did work with a tent company in London, and then asked young architects to help them make that tent nicer. David Page is one of the people who started early on doing that stuff. And again, it's sort of great to find an organization that engages young architects, helping them along the way. They came to us and they said, this is the scope. It's a 1,500 feet long tent, and it's 150 feet wide. So it's 250,000 square foot of tent. And the exercise actually consists of sort of laying out, this is the London plan, it's sort of like an urban planning exercise, but it's mostly like how do you get rid of as much booths as possible. And you have these, and in our case, because it is, the proportion would be 2 aisles with booths along it. We thought this would be a very, very grateful experience to walk for 100 feet, turn around and walk back. Also, we thought the site itself, it's a beautiful site along the water, and I think the idea of engaging the site in such a way was something we tried in our work to find a way for people to be aware actually of the physical place and location where they are. And so we wanted to find a way to open up this very rigid structure. And we worked with the tent company itself. We said, what if you now start to, can we develop within this rental material, can we develop this sort of wedge, a transparent wedge or a wedge that sort of opens up, which gives a lot of flexibility to the shape itself. It also helps organize this area into 6 distinct zones, and it is a way to open up to the park. So here you see sort of the plan of how it would work. And because these triangles, you can't rent out a triangle, or it's not a useful space, right? From an art or booth standpoint, they were in a way guaranteed to be public because they're in a way unusable. So they became like the civic spaces or the squares within this grid of galleries. And the great thing was that because of this, actually they were able to get the tent longer because it could better apply sort of around the coast line of the island. And so here you see the river, you see the park. We were able to get all the mechanical plugins for services on one side, which allowed us to keep this entire waterfront free, and places where the tent would open up towards the water and towards the park. So here you see that as well. It made it to the Guinness Book of Records of the largest tent, which is one of the things you didn't name in the introduction. But what's also nice is so we see that the experience, and because of the lifting the tent, we were able to keep all the mechanical systems because it's hard to be very climatized. We can put them all underneath, so it's completely clear. We have daylight and then sort of bright fluorescent lights lighting the entire space. But you see sort of how this shape starts to meander and walk away. And because of that, you're actually continuously changing your perspective as you move through the space. And here you see one of these triangles and how it sort of creates these great spaces, and it opens up for social activities on the outside and engages in the park. And then at the end, we didn't like this gable as a signifier of this tent, so we pulled the fabric over it to create an in-between space there between the landscape and the building itself. So these were two early projects, and then quite early as well, we got a fantastic commission, and this is what now is also on show at the Art Institute here, which is in Seoul, Korea. So this is Seoul, looking south from the mountains in the north, and on the right here is the old palace, and this is a historic neighborhood where the homes of the people that work in the palace stand. This is one of the few neighborhoods in Seoul left with beautiful historic courtyards, homes, hanok homes. And so because it's such a nice agreeable area, there's a lot of art galleries moving in, and some coffee shops, and it's one of the few pedestrian areas within Seoul. This is an old picture of the site, a very similar point of view, and the site is actually right here, literally here. This is an image we came across, and it's weird to acknowledge that sometimes you're inspired by something as simple as an old painting of the site. But what's very interesting here is, in a way, how the build and the surrounding are completely blending each other. So the haziness, the diffuseness of the image was something that was also something that, in a way, became motivated for the project. It is a third space we had to do for this gallery. So K1 is their first gallery building. They were built, and K2 is the second. And we were asked to make that third space and actually integrate these three buildings because it had sort of grown over time into this neighborhood. And here you see these beautiful historic courtyard homes. It had grown because the palace had sort of grown organically in the neighborhood, but now with their third building, actually they got a new face towards an alley here. And it was important to start thinking of it as a campus with the entries and such. I will only speak about the building, the third building. So here the brief again was very straightforward. Let's make the biggest box possible, which we did. They wanted to show larger art. Art is getting bigger and bigger, and so for galleries, basically they need to offer a large column-free space. So they asked us just to make the biggest box we could, which we through zoning and some analysis determined to be of a certain proportion. And we wanted to emphasize, in a way, to make it clear the singularity of this box. So we put a whole other program, which is mostly circulation program, out. So this is the entrance vestibule, elevator takes you down, a staircase to take you down. There's two much larger areas. The entire site is dug out, 2 floors with a theater, and office spaces and storage spaces and such. And then a staircase that takes you up to the roof. And so we thought that this sort of crude diagram, how does that fit within this site? And right before we went to present, we found elastic silver stocking, and we wrapped this building in that stocking in a way to soften or veil, if you want, the crudeness and the singularity of that diagram, and create a much more ambiguous edge, something that would soften basically how this building would sit within this historic fabric. And so this is what you do in school, and then you present, and then everybody says great, but in this case we presented it to our client. She said great, and she said make it. But we had absolutely no idea what it was, because we knew it needed to be double curved. We knew it probably needed to be something made out of metal or steel. We did not want to have a secondary structure because of its complex geometry. You either have to shingle this, or you have to crease it, or apply it in some sort of way. And we were absolutely not interested in the actual form of the thing. We didn't want to sort of determine, so to say, this shape and then try to reconstruct it out of triangles or some sort of substructure. So we needed something that could take on this double curvature in some sort of way that was strong, but that would not be, say, faceted or cut up. And so this is actually true. We did get inspired by the armor at the Art Institute in Chicago. We came across this chain link mesh, which through the way it sits together, it can take on this double curvature in a very beautiful and seamless and organic way. But this only exists for people who like to dress like medieval guards or fencers or butcher gloves, and not on the scale of architecture. So on the left you see the largest scale you can actually that this thing is being produced in, which is not much more than it's like half an inch or even less. And so if this is the scale of the building, then what's the scale of, or if this is the scale of the body, then what's the scale of the building? We started just by laser cutting some cardboard rings, trying to sort of get a grasp of how, what's the right balance here in this size. And what we also discovered is how does this elasticity actually work? How can it take on this double curvature? And it became already very clear that there's 2 directions in which this material behaves, and it behaves very differently in one direction than the other. And we understood how, the sort of level of stretchability that would work visually as well. So it determined that there would be a certain range in which this thing could expand. And then we made a map of the buildings and draped it over it to see if that would work. And then we engaged Front, Mike Ra, an engineering friend and firm we had worked with in the past, and we asked them to help us actually figure out how to design this further. And so once we had the shape determined, we needed to understand how the forces would work through that shape, and so they modeled the load paths and structural forces through these different shapes. And at some point we had the whole thing modeled in the computer, and we had a very good understanding of geometrically how it would work and also structurally how it would work. And in the meantime, because this had never been done before, we had a double sort of test in the physical realm. So this is a 1/10 scale model we made in our office with sort of this size you could buy fabricated. And we literally used the ring counts here to determine how much of this material was necessary. And it also showed us the possibility of a completely seamless building. So once we had figured out what it was, then we thought, shit, we're going to translate this now in Korean and then try to bid it out. And that seemed very, very complicated, so we decided to just fabricate it ourselves. We went to our client and we asked them to help us supply the material. We went online to Alibaba.com, which at that point was not so well known as now. We typed in ring mesh And very quickly, we got a lot of Skype requests, and we started to Skype with people from different places. And at some point, we were Skyping with a girl called Ring for a long time, and she came from Anping. And Anping is about 6 hours southwest of Beijing. And after Skyping for a while, we received this sample, and that looked very promising. This is on the roof of our office in Brooklyn. And so we decided that we need to visit the Ring, and I don't know how many of you have found their partners online, but this is the first time we actually go and meet somebody in person. It's always really, really exciting. So we flew to Beijing, we drove for 6 hours, and we arrived in Anping. And so Anping is a small town with only workshops, and in the back of the address that they gave us was a very small courtyard, I would say a third or even less in this room. And there was one boy, the brother of Rain, and he was there welding our samples together. This is Jing, this is me, this is Ring, this is Mike, our engineer. And here Jing is explaining that we needed 500,000 rings. So that seemed like a lost journey. But then Ring said, well, it's funny, everybody can weld here in this town. And so we started to work actually with them to develop a method that we could scale up, where more people could participate rather than just her brother. And we figured out this system with plywood, where indeed groups could work on these meshes at once. So it is true, every single ring is hand welded and then it's hand sanded. So that we
你刚才说的基础不好，就是还不好看，就是大概演练一下。
I won't show you all 500,000, but we ultimately made 14 of these large slots. We used the local car wash space for the cleaning of the mesh. Here is Jeff from front doing quality control, actually checking welds. We made a mock-up at the local school, and it was approved. And so then we to ship it to Korea, where the building that's approved, the diagram had already been built in concrete, and we built our drapes so that we built in this pure ornamental field. And so here you see the building as it sits within this small gray urban fabric. At the back you see the pallets. And what's interesting is the building itself is so sort of packed into this neighborhood that you can never really see it as a whole thing. You walk through these small alleys, and then suddenly it appears, and it appears as something you can't completely grasp. So you can walk around it, and you see the space starts to appear between the hard diagram and this mesh. And so at bases you can get in between, here going up, or the entry through a glass vestibule, which is a piece of space. The gallery, very straightforward art space with daylight and an opening. We do think again that bringing in light making people aware of where they are is essential also in spaces that sometimes are afraid of light. Here you see the staircase sort of peeling off and taking you into the lower level where there's a theater for 60 people where they do performances and lectures. So this is the deal room, this is where people buy art. And here this relationship between the old and the new. elements that we also designed and engineered together with Frank that create this new say, expression, roof expression. And so different times of the day, the light falls through in a different way, and it changes what circles you actually see. This is the roof with the light from the gallery light. The project that happened concurrently that in some way can be seen as the inverse of this. And being a young New York office, doing also quite some work on old buildings. And this is an office space we did for Logan. Logan is a digital production company that works completely in the virtual domain. So they have basically make animations and videos for all digital trailers for games and such. And it's also an interesting company because they have only 4 people, but they work with freelancers on a project base. And it means that they need to be able to, in that space, house a variety of people who don't always work with each other in very flexible settings. And so here you see the plan. This is Soho, this is Grand Street, this is Green Street. And so what we basically made for them is two very long tables with a very, very hefty infrastructure here where everybody can plug in. The legs are inset and the wheels are faster, so they can actually densify or relax the density depending on the project you're working on and the group they're working in, the constellation you're working in. And the grid of the columns, the gas iron column grid actually defined the placement of these tables. But so we wanted to have a space in some way defined or that gave some sort of framework independent of with how many people you were in that space. So sometimes it would be very occupied, sometimes it would be completely empty. Actually, I should first say the part of the scope was also a meeting room for the clients and the director here and assistant. So we built a glass wall that cuts straight through these tables. And so the director and the meeting room happens at the same table where people are working. There's a photo studio here, editing booths, big server area, mechanical unit to cool the server, more editing booths, and come in here. And so we wanted to think of this, how to control light within the space, so because everybody is working on screens, and also how do you define these boundaries between these different groups of people working. And so we decided to make the walls out of a single sheet of seamless fabric that spans the entire length of the space among the tables. So these are these walls here that are made out of this membrane. That in a way starts to create a layerness between these different work environments. It does suggest, say, the presence of another behind, but doesn't give it more than just a shadow or a silhouette if you want. And so also it controls the light situation, mitigates the daylight coming in. The ceiling is also stretched fabric with a dimmable ceiling behind, so that the light up to be very carefully calibrated. We also cover the old building itself, and so the historic in a way comes, it's present behind the screen as sort of a ghost. This is the heating system. And here you see these long tables with in the end glass wall where the computer is editing booths, which are very dark felt and corrugated felt. And here you see the space is empty, almost as sort of a mirror image, these two tables in the space. I'm going to show more competitions of museums we've done because it's hard to only do office projects, and so we try to also reach out and us not necessarily coming out of the US condition gives us also the possibility to pursue work elsewhere, such as Belgium, which has or used to have, might have a very good way of procuring public public work. And so that means that all, say, buildings built by with government money in some way need a serious competition for which quality is actually criteria by which selection happens. And so we've joined a number of competitions, and this is one we did about a year ago for a museum in Hasselt. And it's a museum of contemporary art, but it's a museum without a collection. It's actually a space where all public money that goes into art is used to create a platform for the citizens to engage with art and other ideas. And so this is located in this town in Hasselt, which is a beautiful medieval town with an old historic center in the north of Belgium, close to the Dutch border. And what happens with many of these nice historic towns is they turn into great destinations for restaurants and bars and retail. And so this area in the center of town is this shopping and nightlife district. And this Institute for Art, for Contemporary Art, sits behind this wall that I showed you in this beautiful old convent garden. So the nuns used to live here. There was a church. It used to be here. It's now a ruin. It was destroyed in the war by German bombers, and they left it as a ruined building. And here's this museum that was built in 1958 as a designated art space. The scope was to renovate that space, to demolish this big historic school that had been built in the 80s. It was not used anymore, so expand the museum over here, build this, bring this up to energy code and accessibility code. And the museum had used these courtyard homes where the nuns used to live also as exhibition spaces. The beauty of this site was actually that it was sort of a hidden enclosed garden in this very dense commercial district. It being public money, the building needed to open up to the city, needed to open up to the audience. So this was the only way to get in initially. But so the question was, how can we make this more publicly accessible? How can we get people in to enjoy art? But what is very interesting about this institute is their programming is very, very, say, avant-garde, early on, do-it-yourself, idea-driven sort of set of programs. And we felt that actually they need, in a way, if you want this wall and this sort of in-between zone to protect some of these ideas as they emerge, and opening up directly to the city would in a way weaken and make it sort of generic institute that we see everywhere. So we started to work or think about this idea of, can we use this old area, can we use this edge again as sort of a filter, as something that offers resistance, that you actually have to work yourself through, and through working through this filter, it actually affects you and changes you, at least for a little bit. You see that these green and blue things turn back again at some point, so you have to come back. And so this became an operative diagram. We wanted to work with the elements that were there. So if you look carefully at this area, actually it was very simple layering that happened through purely walls and openings. Also the existing building had quite generic spaces, but its sort of character came out of the opening in the wall. And so we started to think, can we make a design that is only sort of, it has as a driver exploration of the relationship between the opening and the wall. And it being a museum building, automatically you start looking at sort of an empty organization, which is a traditional way of planning a museum. It's a very traditional way of telling a story, telling a curatorial story, right? You go from one room to the next, you get the point through. But we thought this is not the way in which people nowadays engage with stories. We don't like to have stories being told to us in a singular way. We like to navigate through the material ourselves. We like to create our own stories. So this shows you a series of studies we did. This being the classic way of organizing galleries. This may be a more modern way where the space starts to flow between the rooms. And after some study we set on, I think it comes afterwards, we then, to impress the Belgians, wrote a very, very complicated grasshopper script that shows the super precise calibration that will happen between wall and opening. There's also a desire to have it gradually become larger as you come. So here on the left is where the city is, and the back is the yard. So there's an idea that as you come further through these layers, it actually opens up and it engages further with the garden. So ultimately we set on this gallery organization where every other crossing is where the opening is. And this means that every time that you come to an opening, you actually have to make a choice. And you have to start choosing your own path, and in a way creating your own story, which means there's a completely different way also to design exhibitions and to think of exhibitions, much less linear, much more sort of in parallel, or much more sort of, you can create different types of paths routing through this. So it was also a challenge to the curators to think differently of what the infrastructure of the museum can be. We didn't want to build sort of an odd extension, so we integrated the old and the new. We took the grid, or if there wasn't any, but took the order of the existing on the right, and we expanded it to the left. And then we made these openings both in the old and both in the new and the old. So the old itself also transformed to start to function within this system itself. And here you see a model of those two things combined. This being the old here, and this the new. And in a way, so the extension, the space comes together not by adding, but actually by taking away, by integrating it into this one singular system. Here you see the plan. So you enter here on the corner, on the this is a courtyard, and from here you get into the old entry, and pass you into the courtyard from here. So you enter the same space. And I won't explain all the separate spaces, but what was more important is that we actually provided sort of a whole diverse catalog of different rooms, because their program was so dynamic and so constantly changing that we felt it didn't make sense to respond to a very specific program, but actually really offer them, if you want, a catalog of spaces that could be used in different ways. It could be used as galleries, for instance, and we literally only designed the structure if it needed to be used as a gallery. Walls could be added if we didn't want to hang on the structure itself. Otherwise, it could be used as a library or other things. So in a way, a different type of flexibility, not by making a very big box, but actually offering a variety of spaces for this dynamic program. Here you see some studies of how we show different shows. They would always have at least two shows happening at the same time, which you can imagine some sort of checkerboard program, or one side or next. And how it becomes part of the fabric of the city and part of this wall. We varied the height a little bit between the new built to break it down and bring it in daylight on the floor. And this is the image at the end. And this is also the image why we lost, because it wasn't brick. They wanted it to be brick, the building, so we got the second prize, which is okay, because we did a very good exploration for ourselves. And as we tend to do, is we like to think of these ideas not necessarily stuck to one program. So recently we were asked to design a show in the Netherlands for a private couple, private collection by a couple in the State Museum in Amsterdam. And there they asked us to think of a show. It was a 30-year a collection they built over 30 years. And so then we in some way thought, can the same idea of making choices or being forced to make choices, could that be an organization that would also apply to this idea of collecting, where you're also continuously forced to make choices, and where you have to find sort of your own relationships and connections between different artists. And so we were able to build the installation in Amsterdam this summer. And it's very interesting because again it shows to, it actually worked very interesting installation. There were many different ways to walk through this collection. People would come back and take different paths and have different types of experiences and see different types of relationships and long lines within the connection itself. So last project is a project we are currently working on in which some of these ideas that I've shared come together. This is Davis in Northern California, UC Davis, University of California in Davis. The agrarian or agricultural part of the UC system happens here. A very nice, very green campus, the most bike-friendly campus in the United States. You see the agricultural land in the back, and here you see the school. 35,000 students, many of which who end up working in the vineyards in Napa Valley and Sonoma Valley. And so, although they're very good sort of biotechnical trained minds, some of the people that run these vineyards have the feeling that they need to be exposed a little bit more to culture. And so what they started to do is build here towards this south side of the campus a more sort of cultural quad, which would also, because this is the highway between San Francisco and Sacramento, form in a way the face, if you want, of this campus. And so the Mondavi Center of Performing Arts was built here a number of years ago, and the Mondavi Center for Wine and Food was also built here at some point, and the Mondavis were able to talk the Shremps into building a museum over here on this new sort of quad. Here's the Alumni Center, and here's the Conference Center. And so here on this complicated site, a triangle along with a train track with freight trains and a highway to sort of finish this idea of, say, the presence of culture within this university. But the difficult thing was this museum didn't have a collection. It didn't really exist before this plan was made, and also the people going here did not necessarily, come from an arts background or there was the challenge of how to seduce people actually to come and to this part of campus and engage with something they might not automatically be interested in. What is very fascinating in this landscape, in some way felt from the Dutch, is the idea of the landscape as a productive site. So not just something beautiful that you can see change, but actually a land that you shape, so where you are in control and where you have sort of an impact on its outcome. And the ground itself has that sense. And also when you are at the campus there, that's really the feeling you get. There are two important artists. They have influenced that are part of the legacy of these days. One is Wayne Thiebaud. Here, these are landscape paintings he made of the Central Valley that plays with the patterns and the light. And Robert Artisan, the head of the funk art movement, it's called, which is sort of anti-minimalist, anti-Donald Judd, that play with this idea of the quirky, the unserious, he brought ceramics back into the contemporary arts field, but there's some sort of sense of being off and being anti-establishment as well. So these are that's sort of the mind that influenced the thinking there. But then, how do you make a museum in a time that artists themselves leave the museum, that don't want to be in a museum, but also where for a generation that doesn't believe that visual culture necessarily happens in a museum, that are curating their own visual experiences. Everybody can be a curator, everybody has their own sensibilities, how to get people to come to a place in which these stories are told to you rather than you tell them yourself. Different ways in which art is being produced and funded. And this whole notion of publicness in UC Davis was where, for instance, also the student protest, this pepper spray was at UC Davis. So how do you make a building that is paid for by private donors public and not some sort of a treasure chest for the establishment? And lastly, what is its relationship between the artificial and the natural in a place where people clone sheep and cows and think that they can design hunger out of the world, which is really what UC Davis is. So what's the relationship between the natural and the artificial and this hybrid and stuff? So this was interesting. This was a competition. It was a design-build competition, which means you have to team up with a contractor. And we teamed up also with a local architect, Bowling Twins, Jackson. So the work we did was together. It's public money from the University of California, so they say here's $25 million, and that's all. And give us the best you can, including your fees. They're also in that number. And everything you go over is your own at your own risk. But what was also good within this process is that there was a dialogue with the jury, so you didn't go in just blank. We had 3 meetings with them, and we worked with them on this process and trying to define the direction of this museum. And this image became a very something that was very well received in a sense that it helped us think about the museum nowadays. It's to be much more infrastructure that helps so that people generate their own ideas or participatory structure which is open and it can continuously evolve. We went through a number of physical studies, and at some point this idea of a line that sort of weaves through the site and creates a variety of spaces, but in a way this is an image we found that shows this thing coming out of this flat landscape, sort of rising silhouette. And then dealing with the environment as filtering, if you want, sort of the environmental conditions. We covered the challenge of also how to make something that looks much bigger than it is, because the program was quite small and the site was big. And so we thought, what if we covered this entire site with this large open roof, so a grand canopy, as we call it, where all these different activities can take place, both inside and outside, which again is not hyper tightly related to the program, but actually just through a variety of spaces and all for different types of use. And so it's created this patchwork of different spaces, and only after that we started to project sort of the program and the use on it. In its center, the entry, so you enter through this large public area, straight here into the heart of the building, education and art making very actively in front. Courtyard spaces, this is office and operations, and the gallery spaces here with the art link that goes through the entire building, actually very open. So there's also again visual relationship to the outside. Here you see this roof as it rises. And the entry to the lobby. And now we'll get back to this infill because this is something we generated during the competition through the lobby spaces, gallery spaces. And so then this large roof, in a way, a place to mitigate the climate, to have, say, campus life continue under its seamless or a very light threshold between campus and the building itself, a place that the students themselves can use and activate. So it's a place where you can go without necessarily being forced to see certain things, but where you gradually sort of maybe get sucked into seeing art. We then build competition means you have to work very fast, but have to give an incredible amount of definition, which means we also had to specify the infill of these beams, but we were very unhappy with that. We wanted to make this infill a much more active part of the experience, and again, sort of work on this idea of the veil as a way to make people aware of where they are on site. And this is also during the big droughts there in California, and we thought, can the sun and the shades, can it be used to create differentiation within this canopy space itself? So we started to look, can we create a shadow that is not just a singular shadow, so these flat sheets, you just a hole and it will be black or white, depending on the open and closed. But what is very interesting, if you look at shadows of trees, there's sort of a layeredness that starts to happen. And so we start to explore both physical and in the computer different ways in which you can control shadow patterns and create sort of difference between these different infills. We had to work with the money we had for the flat sheet. And so where the flat sheet fits within the secondary steel, so the main steel, the secondary steel, and the infill, we tried to see what would happen if you start to merge those two, and actually the infill and the secondary steel becomes one. And we're able to transition from this baseline to triangulated perforated beams that expand the entire width of the roof. And here was the test we did on our roof in Brooklyn. We start to see how through this layering of these triangles, different levels of depth, of different amounts of layering start to happen. Again, we made a big model which we presented because this meant a big change in the project. It was very tightly managed, and we were able to convince them. And this allowed us, these are the three, say, parameters that allow us to vary the way the light falls through, so the spacing, the orientation, and the openness. And so with this, we have been able to, in a way, create a whole different range of ways that light falls through the canopy itself. So this is the best
Yeah.
So we did a very crude mock-up, we're building a more complicated mock-up, and a more correct mock-up. And now, on site, and construction has started in 2016. This should be open for the next for the semester starting. Yeah. I'll end with a small project that goes back to the one project. So this was a building I worked on for a long time and brought me to New York. It has an expanded metal mesh facade, which is basically a flat sheet that you cut. Because of the way you cut it, it turns into this three-dimensional form. And so recently we were asked to do a quick installation in China for the architectural biennale in China, and we were interested in thinking, hey, what if we cut it in a different way? Because when you cut it flat, you can only expand it in one direction, it becomes longer. But we sort of just played with an idea of cutting in a different pattern, so we cut in the circle, and then thought maybe we can make something out of this. So again, we sent it to China, and then it goes from here to here. And we made 16 of them, and they were installed in front of the bird's nest in Beijing, creating sort of a very ephemeral structure through which the light comes out. That's it. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions, so if anyone...
It seems like a lot of these buildings explore like the way the qualities of material at small scale influence the overall large shape of the building, structure. Is that something that your practice actively exploring?
We're not interested in the shape, but we are interested in the way, say, material. We're not interested in the material in itself, but we are interested in ways in which material can help us experience space and place, and locus, so where you are. So again, material in a way help you become aware of some of these physical conditions that you inhabit.
The office design that you guys showed us with the screened walls and,
Yeah.
and the continuous tables. I'm curious how the acoustics ended up in the, like how they would play out with the
So
screen.
between the two table spaces, it's just fabric. Then the meeting room has a glass wall separating, cutting through the table. But there we actually also made a glass wall between the two rooms, which means that the meeting room, in a way, is a glass enclosed space, and so is the director's office. But between the tables themselves, there's no acoustical separation, and that was also not really the point there. But for the meeting rooms, it was very important, and for the director's office as well. What is interesting is if you come there now, everybody is working like this, right? So this is the new privacy. So it's yeah. There have always also been questions about cleaning, and the funny thing is it's actually very cheap material. It takes 2 days to install and deinstall, so we made 2 of them, 2 basically sets of walls, and they can go to the dry cleaner. It's installed with Velcro, but they haven't needed to do it to change it yet. So there's a spare set, but it's no, it's in very good shape. The other day we went to show it. It's been up for a year and a half now, and yeah. I expect at least one difficult question from you.
We have dinner. Okay, let's go and have, thank you, Florian.